A small town on the edge of the forest always lived a quiet and measured life. People knew each other, greeted each other on the street, discussed the weather, and shared the latest news. But one day, everything changed. On a day when autumn brought its first cold winds, strange and frightening events began to occur in the town. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗜𝗘, a young woman who had recently moved to the town, lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. She was independent and self-reliant, and she had always liked that way of life. She worked at the local library, often staying late, going through archival materials, or reading her favorite novels. But one evening, when she returned home, she found something that would change her life forever. In front of her door lay a note, neatly folded in half and sealed with red wax. It contained just a few words. "Your turn is coming." At first, 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 thought it was someone's bad joke, but the feeling of unease that began to grow inside her wouldn't leave her alone. She looked around, but the corridor was empty, as usual. Uneasily, 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 slipped the note into her pocket and entered her apartment. The next morning, 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 couldn't shake the thoughts about the note. She told her colleagues at work, but they just laughed it off and said it was probably some kid playing a prank. But that evening, when she returned home, she found another note on the floor. This time the words were even more disturbing. "They are watching you. You can't hide." 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 felt her heart start to race. She quickly picked up the note and locked the door with every lock she had. She seriously considered calling the police, but what could she tell them? That someone was leaving notes at her door. It seemed so absurd and unreal that she couldn't bring herself to do it. But the fear began to creep deeper into her mind. Another day passed, and again in the evening when she came home, 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 found a third note. This time it was short. "Are you scared? You should be." 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 could no longer tolerate it. She felt an unknown fear tightening its grip on her. She decided to go to her neighbors and ask if they had seen anyone suspicious near her apartment. The first people she turned to were an elderly couple living one floor below. They kindly invited her into their apartment and listened to her story about the notes. They said they hadn't seen anything unusual but advised her to be careful. Their sympathy did not bring 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 any relief. She felt even more alone. The next day, 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 decided to spend the evening in town, hoping it would help her unwind and forget her fears. She met her friends at a cafe, where they talked and laughed, but thoughts about the notes never left her mind, not even for a moment. Later that evening, when she returned home, a new note was waiting for her. This time, the note was longer and carried a sinister tone. "You think you can escape? They see your every step. They are always near." The words were written, as if the author was enjoying scaring his victim. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 couldn't bear it anymore. She called the police. The police arrived quickly. 2 officers entered her apartment and carefully listened to her story. They examined all the notes and promised to investigate. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 felt a bit relieved when she saw the police writing down her words and promising to establish patrols around the building. But even after their visit, she couldn't shake the feeling that they would find nothing. The next morning, as she opened the door, she found another note. This time, her patience ran out. The note read, "They will come for you. No one will save you." This was the last straw. She decided not to wait and take action herself. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 began to observe her surroundings more closely. She recorded everything her eyes could see: who entered and left the building, who parked near the entrance, who frequently passed by her door. She even set up a small camera by her doorstep, hoping to catch the unknown tormentor. A week passed, and nothing happened. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 began to think that the whole story had ended, but one night she was awakened by a strange sound. She heard something lightly scratching at her door. She got out of bed and approached the door, her heart frozen in fear. On the floor lay a new note. This time, the note came with something more. Attached to it was a photograph of 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘, taken while she was walking down the street. It was shot from a close distance, which meant only one thing: she was being watched. 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 panicked. She didn't know what to do. The police, whom she called again, promised to increase security, but it didn't really help. Meanwhile, the new notes kept appearing. They became even more aggressive and terrifying. One of them read, "Time is running out. Your trial is approaching." 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 began to lose sleep and appetite. She feared every rustle, every unfamiliar sound. Her apartment, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. One night, when 𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘 was almost asleep, she heard a loud knock at the door. She jumped up in bed but didn't dare to open it. The knocking repeated, forcing her to approach the door. She pressed her ear to the door and heard a quiet whisper open the door. "𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗘𝗘." We're waiting for you." Katya felt the blood freeze in her veins. She slowly backed away but kept listening. A few more seconds and the knocking stopped. It seemed everything had gone quiet, but suddenly the door gave way to a forceful blow and the lock broke. The door burst open with a crash, and before her stood an old man with a disfigured face. His skin was wrinkled and covered in scars. One side of his face was deformed, as if from a burn or a terrible injury. He looked at her with cold, dead eyes, and a raspy sound came from his mouth as if he were trying to speak. Katya felt the fear paralyze her body. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her legs gave way, and she fell to the floor. The old man slowly approached her, extending his bony hands. His touch was as cold as ice. He roughly lifted her to her feet and dragged her to the door. Outside the door, a black car was waiting for Katya, parked right in front of the entrance. She tried to fight, to scream, but it was all in vain. The old man opened the back door of the car and forcibly shoved her inside. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the car sped away, leaving the empty, dark entrance behind. Katya had no idea where they were taking her. She could only hear the monotonous sound of the engine and feel the cold metal beneath her hands. When the car finally stopped, they pulled Katya out and dragged her to an old, half-ruined house standing isolated, far from the town. The house was large, with peeling walls and broken windows. It reeked of rot and neglect. Katya was dragged into the house and thrown onto the floor in a dark room. The old man silently closed the door behind her, leaving her in complete darkness. Katya lay on the floor, trying to understand what was happening. She felt the cold concrete beneath her and realized she was in a basement. The room was almost empty, with only an old chair in one corner and a small table with some tools in another. Katya realized she had fallen into the hands of the maniac who had been sending her those terrifying notes. She tried to find a way out, but the door was securely locked and the only window was barred. The only thing she could do was scream, but her voice was muffled by the thick basement walls. Hours, maybe days, passed. Katya lost track of time. She felt fear and despair filling every cell of her body. And then one day the door opened, and the same old man with the disfigured face entered the room. He silently looked at her, holding a long knife in his hand. Katya realized with horror that this was her last day. She tried to run, but the old man was too fast. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the floor. She felt his knife enter her body, and pain pierced through her like thousands of needles. This maniac believed that he could cleanse his victims through suffering and pain. Every stab of the knife, every movement of his hand was, for him, a kind of ritual by which he freed the souls of his victims from their sins. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just concentrated on performing his twisted ritual. Katya felt her consciousness beginning to fade. She knew this was the end, but the despair and fear that overwhelmed her were so strong that she prayed for only one thing: that this nightmare would end as quickly as possible. When the old man finally finished his cleansing, Katya lay on the floor, completely drained and exhausted. Her life was slowly fading away, and the last thing she saw was the disfigured face of the old man, who looked at her with an inexplicable expression of satisfaction and calm. He had fulfilled his task, and now she was cleansed. Katya died that day, but her fear and suffering remained within the walls of that house. The old man left no trace, and when the police finally found the house, it was empty. Only one detail made them stop. On the table, next to the knife that had become the instrument of her death, lay another note: "She is cleansed. And now it's your turn.